right, we're going to finish strong. We've got the former CTO of Ripple and current co-founder and CEO of Coil, Stefan Thomas, on stage with our very own David Schwartz. They'll be conducting a fireside chat and talk about all the amazing work that's going on at Coil.
Well, I just want to start out, Stefan. Thank you so much for being here. This is a privilege, and it's going to be so much fun.
Thank you. It's so good to be back on stage with you. It's always you're always my favorite interviewer of all. So,
I'm sure people can't help but noticing that there's two CTOs of Ripple on the stage today. You know, it's kind of like seeing, I don't know, maybe Batman and Clark Kent at the same time or something. Yes, that was intentional. So I guess let's start out with a little bit of sort of inside baseball stuff. I'm going to tell a little story, then I'm going to ask you for some stories. So one story I'll tell you, you know the story, you were there as well as I was. You left to start Coil, and I took over, big shoes to fill, as CTO at Ripple, and we had a meeting, and I asked you for some advice, or actually I probably didn't ask you for any advice, I probably didn't know I needed it, you probably just gave it to me anyway, but I'm glad you did. And do you remember what you told me?
I don't.
Really? You told me 4 words that have been incredibly valuable to me. You said to me, you can say no. Now, I know it sounds funny, right? This sounds like, you know, Nancy Reagan, like, just say no to drugs. If you're talking to your drugs, you already said yes, first of all. But anyway.
I hope you said no to any drugs people offered you in the job. It happens all the time.
No, but what I took, Stefan, to mean, and this was tremendously valuable to me, is that people will ask you to do a lot of things, and you can do those things. It's just if you try to do everything, you don't make any useful progress. So I was wondering if you'd like to share a story from your time at Ripple.
Yeah, I mean, where that sort of comes from is like so often it's not about how you're building things as an engineer. It's building the right things, making sure your requirements are right. I think I just saw Elon Musk talk about this, and he said like your requirements are dumb. That's like step 1, you know. And so half the job is really talking to the non-technical people and trying to figure out like what do people actually want the thing to do, rather than trying to solve problems that aren't really problems. You know, another thing is like you just try to get rid of a component entirely rather than you know, optimizing something. I was watching the presentation about XRP-L.js earlier, and you know, they asked you know, anyone heard of, or has anyone heard of Ripple Lib? And I was like, oh yeah, like I helped build that, you know? And I was just really impressed with all the things that they took out. Like there was this entire abstraction layer of how you talk to XRP Ledger that's gone. And you know, I don't know how much time we spent on robust transaction submission. I remember there was like a, was it 2? I think we had like a 5-hour meeting on it, and then decided we needed another meeting on the subject. And like basically that whole thing is just gone. And I'm just like, this is amazing.
We all thought it would just be easy, so easy that we didn't bother like writing down how to do it. And then when someone was like, just like explain like I'm an idiot, how do you do this? I'm like, oh, it's super easy. Let me just explain it. And 5 hours later, we're like, you know, I don't think we. Let's actually know.
Yeah, I think the reason was, so back then we were sort of like, okay, we're the ledger experts. We know how the ledger works better than anyone else, you know. So all these plebs out there, they're not going to know how to do robust transaction submissions. So we tried to build it into Ripple Lib. But if you think about it, like when people are actually using Ripple Lib would have bugs and fail and so on. And so they had to build their own robust transaction submission anyway. And so ours was just a bunch of extra complexity that nobody needed. And I wish we had realized that back then. So it's the lesson is be humble, you know, and also when you're working with your community, like trust them, you know, they know what they're doing.
We had something very similar recently. We were designing an API, and we had this one state where it was easier because you had certain information you wouldn't normally have. And we realized if we wrote code for that state, we'd still need code for the state where you don't have that information. So by trying to make this simpler thing, we just added one more thing to the set of things that you needed to deal with.
So having spent a lot of time working on IntelLedger, there's a similar concept in the internet, and they call it the end-to-end principle, which is like, you know, problems are going to happen on every layer. So don't try to solve them on every layer. Try to solve them as late as possible once.
Like packet loss on the internet.
Packet loss.
You could solve packet loss everywhere in the internet, and it would be worse.
Exactly. exactly. And so, yeah, it's just a good lesson.
So for people who haven't been in crypto forever, this is another thing in crypto. It's so rapidly changing that there's a sort of set of things that everybody in crypto now knows. And 4 years from now, you sort of assume people still know it. And of course, they don't because they're new. And so you constantly have to keep like educating people about the past. And I'm going to pick a piece of the past to educate people about, which, because it's great, is your origin story.
Yeah, wow, that's a long time ago now.
Right?
I feel incredibly old by crypto standards. Like I'm 80 by crypto standards. You know, like
it's funny.
So how did crypto start for me? So first of all, this was 2010. You know, some of the things that people can't even imagine nowadays is like there was no Bitcoin price, right? Like there was no, because there were no exchanges yet. And so the way you would know what a Bitcoin is worth, you know, first of all, I think people were still talking in the forum about resetting the live network, the live Bitcoin blockchain, you know, because there were still things being fixed and changed, and so there was still, you know, people like, oh, we might reset it, you know. And then the way you would know Bitcoins were, you know, worth something was there was this IRC channel called Bitcoin OTC, and they had a little website, and you know, on that website were some people who were like, you know, 10,000 Bitcoins for, and then, you know, whatever they wanted to
Pizza
trade it
most
for.
famously.
Most famously for pizza, exactly, 2 pizzas.
Yes.
Yeah, that's how I bought my first Bitcoin. Was like somebody had like, you know, Bitcoin for PayPal. I was like, nice, it's convenient, you know. I'm sure PayPal didn't know about that, but that's how I got my first Bitcoin.
They wouldn't have known what it was.
Yeah. And I guess when you say origin story, you probably mean like, how did I find out about it? And at the time, I was obsessed with this tool called StumbleUpon, which is just basically somebody saw it. Yeah, somebody knows about it. And it was just this like browser toolbar, and it would have like a button called Stumble, and you would click it, you go to a random website. And it's, you know, in Vegas, it's like a slot machine. You just want to keep clicking the button to see what you get, you know. And I got Bitcoin.org, and I was like, what's this, you know? And that's how it all started.
So in your journey at Ripple, you were one of the developers of the Interledger protocol. You want to tell people what problem that solves and how it solves it?
Yeah, it's interesting because that, you know, the problem it solves really starts with when I was working on Bitcoin, because, you know, we obviously knew that there were certain things about Bitcoin that we'd like to improve. There was this thing called the hard fork wish list, where developers who wanted to improve the protocol could write down their ideas and their things that they think would make Bitcoin better. And because I was sort of a Bitcoin advocate, this was very public, like I gave some of the first keynotes about Bitcoin, and I gave a lot of media interviews, especially in the German-speaking world. I made that little animated video about Bitcoin, I produced it, and that was the most popular way people would tell each other about Bitcoin, and then that had a website at the end, so people would go to the website, and then they would contact us thinking that we had created Bitcoin, which we obviously didn't. But as a result, I knew all the problems that people were running into. And so I was very interested in the hard fork wish list and how do we solve these problems, how do we make this easier to use, because I was passionate about the potential of the technology, but it still seemed so far away from what you would need for, you know, the rest of my family to use it, or, you know, just a random person who isn't super technical and is not gonna know, you know, doesn't even have the computer that's powerful enough to download a full Bitcoin blockchain, etc. And so, obviously you can do a lot on the client side. So in my case, you know, I was a JavaScript developer, I was a web developer, so I built Bitcoin.js, which was the first JavaScript implementation of Bitcoin, which, you know, some amazing people are still maintaining, and I'm incredibly grateful that I don't have to anymore. Yeah, that was step one. But then there were certain things you just have to improve the protocol, and one of the features that I was very interested in was smart contracts, and so I wanted to make it more viable for people to use smart contracts. And so at the time, basically, if you wanted to pay to a multi-sign address on Bitcoin, it would be like this really long address. And the reason was that it had to encode all the public keys and all the addresses of the multi-sign. And so, you know, we wanted to solve that, and we came up with this thing called pay-to-script hash, which is a different Bitcoin address format where everything just sort of gets hashed. That's the script hash, so you're paying to a Bitcoin script. And that implementation from start to finish really took about a year almost. And I remember printing out the hard fork wish list and kind of looking at, you know, that list, and it was like 50 years worth of work. And so
at that pace, right?
at that pace. And it was foreseeable that it would get even slower, right? And even back then, we were thinking about things like, we had the presentation about sidechains earlier and stuff like that, and like, how do you, is that maybe the solution? So you build a lot of different ledgers, but then obviously you have the challenge of how do you connect them all together, right? And then fast forward, I joined Ripple, and we started working a lot on like XRP Ledger type stuff. And some people might assume that like, oh, maybe it's a lot easier to evolve XRP Ledger because there's a dedicated developer team and, it's a more tight-knit community and there's a lot of stuff that's more well-developed. But in practice, it was, almost just as difficult to make changes, right?
Yeah, for good reasons.
Yeah, exactly. It's a system that manages billions of dollars and you don't want it to just blow up in your face, and so you don't want to change a lot of stuff because somebody somewhere had a crazy idea that they want to try out, and so the path to IntelliJ was really thinking about, coming from a web background, being a web developer, like, why don't we have this issue on the web? Like on the web, I always felt I could experiment with all kinds of crazy stuff without worrying that the entire internet was going to go down, And so that started us down this path of trying to understand how these different systems are architected differently. And so with the internet, it's just essentially because things are so loosely coupled. Like, when I'm talking to someone over here, the data just travels between myself and sort of the shortest path between me and them. There isn't like a global network that's talking about everything we're doing. And so when you think about that, you start to think about kind of a world where there are lots and lots of these little pockets of, maybe they're distributed ledgers, maybe some of them are centralized ledgers and so on. And you start to think about like, how do you wire that all together? And that's really what's got the conversation started on IntelliJ.
I think one of the fascinating things, there's some accumulated wisdom that people who've been in this space have, and one piece of accumulated wisdom that I got to watch as, the team that was working on IntelliJ learned it in real time. I think at first the thinking was, this is completely different from anything that anyone else has done. This is a sort of protocol for payments, and payments are just different from everything else. And so everything has to be, payments have things like people who give you a quote on them, and you can exercise the quote or not exercise the quote, and you have a path the payment takes. And what you learned over time was that was actually completely wrong. And it's a fascinating insight, and I was hoping you could share it.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. Like Evan wrote this amazing blog post about I think it's called the IntelliJ Graveyard or something like that. Like
yes.
all the ideas that we scrapped along the way, and really IntelliJ was this sort of journey of taking things out. Like we started with something that was way too complicated, and we just simplified it kind of to what we were talking about at the beginning. And so one of the things that I was looking at recently was, in the early versions of IntelliJ, the way it worked was somebody would make a payment on one ledger, and then the router or connector would see that payment, and then they would make a connection on the next ledger, and so on. And so we had this demo, which we called the 7-ledger demo. It was literally like 7 different ledgers kind of wired together, and it sounds just as it's just as janky as it sounds. It worked maybe, 5% of the time.
You inherit the worst properties of your chain is as strong as its weakest link, and exactly. So for the more interesting and complicated you make the chain, the less likely it is to be useful.
Exactly. So it's like the probability of this live demo working is the probabilities of all the individual ledgers working multiplied together. So, and I think even more so, like even when it did work, you inherit all of the latency properties and delays and fees of all the individual ledgers. And so the overall system is just always strictly worse than the worst of all the ledgers, And we quickly realized that wasn't a good way to create the, magical Jetsons future that we wanted to create, this internet of value that we were talking about. And so, again, kind of thinking about like, how does the internet approach this problem? And what we realized was that let's just send the information that we need to get through, which is I'm trying to make a payment to you, and talking to the ledgers, let's figure that out later, And so it's sort of similar to what card networks do, where like the card networks, they can't wait for some slow bank ledger to update, And so they just talk to each other, they record what's happening, and then every once in a while they tell the slow ledgers what they need to be doing, right? And so that's exactly the approach we took, and then suddenly you get like an interledger packet that goes through with like millisecond latency. And so I think that's another place where sort of interledger fits in, is that, you know, we talk about the ledgers a lot, and we talk about the blockchains a lot, but I think there's a lot of value in having like a layer that's just above that you can use and code against, that's very stable and fast, and then you only talk to the ledgers when you actually need to record a settlement.
One of the ways that I explain that is it's bad if a system requires trust that people don't necessarily have, because that's a cost or risk that they have to bear. But it's perfectly fine if the system leverages whatever trust is already there. If it says, we have some trust right here, how can we use that? So let's say you and I have some way that we can settle. It could be that you're willing to owe me money. It could be you already owe me money, I already owe you money, or we have access to the XRP ledger. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. If you and I can settle, that means I can make a payment to someone if you've promised to pay me for it. And nobody else has to trust you or me. The fact that that trust already exists is something that can be leveraged to build a payment network.
Yeah, and that was inspired by a couple of things. So one, of course, the Ripple Classic or Ripple Pay, which is Ryan Fugger's original idea that goes all the way back to 2004, which is Ripple's namesake and inspiration for a lot of the stuff we built with the decentralized exchange and everything. Or I really should give you the credit. Like the decentralized exchange was pretty well thought out by the time I joined. So, the other source was, if you've seen like, I think it was in Alex's presentation from the Interledger Foundation earlier, he was talking about how if you're doing kind of a more local transfer, that's cheap and easy. And it's only when you're going further away. And I think there's a reason for that. It's sort of trust and interoperability. It's easy to create in a small group, right? And so the thing that Interledger is really designed to do is it's designed to reduce the problem of global trust to a problem of lots of local trust relationships, right? Again, just like Ripple Classic. And so that just turns out to be a really powerful idea.
So let's fast forward just a little bit further. We're kind of going in chronological order. You leave Ripple. You start this thing called Coil to use Interledger and XRP. Why don't you tell people what problem Coil solves and how it solves it?
Yeah. I'm sort of tempted to say that if I'm completely honest, the problem that Coil solves is like, how do we get Interledger adopted?
Right, the problem eBay solves is how do you make eBay shareholders richer, right?
Exactly. And so, but all joking aside, I think when we looked at what could Interledger be useful for, by that point we were so trained to look at the internet for inspiration, and so it became clear that the internet didn't become popular because it was better at making phone calls than the phone networks, or better at sending paper documents than fax machines. It was something different, and so people used it for different things. And so with Interledger, we kind of thought about like, what could those different things be? And it's a really hard question to ask yourself, because you have to imagine the future, right? And you have to imagine like, what might people want to do that they're not at all doing now, But one of the things that we quickly noticed was there were a lot of people that were complaining about all sorts of things related to monetization of content on the web. Whether it's, there's so many ads, and of course we're all experiencing that every day. Whether it's, oh no, these platforms are getting too much power and everyone's going to these few platforms, or, oh no, like these tech companies and ad networks, they have too much data about me and they know too much and they're abusing that. And so when you think about all of those problems, you're sort of like, okay, why is that? Like, why are we all using the same ad network, i.e. Google, And when you sort of unpack that, it's like, well, there were a lot of ad networks at one point, and they sort of started to get consolidated. It's like, okay, well, what was the market force that got them consolidated? Well, because a network that has more data about users and does better targeting will attract, advertisers more, and advertisers will pay them more than if it's a smaller network that doesn't have as much data about users. Okay, well, it's the advertising business model inherently leads to that centralization. And so when you look at the internet or the web without looking at the business model, it's actually something that's fairly well decentralized, right? Like, I can make my own website, I can host it on my own server, anyone can visit it, they can use any internet provider. Like, there's a lot of decentralization built in already. but it's the monetization side that caused it to coalesce more. I also think that obviously mobile had a big part in that. You know, that's a whole separate topic, but I think even there, you know, that was driven by a lot of monetization benefits of putting your app in the App Store instead of making it a web app where you don't necessarily have a built-in way to make money with it. And so that's ultimately what we decided to tackle with Coil, is like figuring out, is there like an open way to do monetization so that people don't have to go to these workarounds.
So what's coming next? Where are you and where are you going to be?
Yeah, so I think what we kind of realized is that, you know, it's a great model to have this like one flat rate for the web, but it's difficult for the websites to really offer a lot of features under that standard when there are so few users, and it's hard to sign up users when there are so few websites that support it. But we got a lot of people who got attracted by, finally there's an open payment protocol. You know, and even people from, you know, who had experimented with blockchain, but they were sort of frustrated that every blockchain was like just promoting their token, and you know, a lot of the systems, you know, XRP excluded, but a lot of the systems are very slow and clunky and hard to work with, and so on. And so they were sort of like, finally, there's just something that feels like TCP/IP, like something where I can just tell it where the money should go, and it takes a few milliseconds, and then the money is there, you know? And also something that, you know, what the internet is really good at is I don't have to worry about what the underlying technology is or what people's preferences are. So like, you know, you might like to use WiMAX, you know, because it has a slightly larger range and you can use it on your ranch or whatever. You know, I don't have to know that or care about it. I can write my application for TCP/IP and you can still use it with your local communications technology. Imagine if we had that for blockchain or even payments in general, where like I can write an application and someone can use it on Cardano, someone can use it on XRP Ledger, someone can use it with their mobile money account, someone can use it with their bank account. It doesn't matter, you know. And so what we're trying to do now is really enable developers to build their applications on IntelliJ, even if they're not necessarily related to web monetization. And so to enable that, we decided that what was really missing was a full stack IntelliJ implementation that wallets can deploy so they can offer all these rich features to their users, so raw IntelliJ access, subscriptions, you know, etc. And that project is called Rafiki, and I think it was mentioned earlier as well. So that's what we're really focused on right now, is this open source project.
Awesome. So I have an idea for you, free of charge. You know how companies like Hulu, and Netflix, and even Peacock have grown by having exclusive content that's only available to their subscribers. What if Coil did something like that? And I'm going to ask you not to use any of the 7 dirty words in your answer.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we actually are doing our own original content right now.
Oh, really?
Yes, we are.
I had no idea.
We launched a podcast last week called Sid and Lydia Talk Stuff, except we didn't use the word stuff. David told me that joke behind the scenes. So
I told him not to use any of the 7 dirty words.
Perfect.
Thank you for
helping me out here. It's like when I'm funny, that's probably just somebody helping me. But anyway, and we've launched some web series. There's The Twist, which is a web series about creators and kind of what's going on the web. They call it squeezing the daily juice from the web. There's a show called Power Over It, which is about Sarah Choi, who's like a drift car racer, and she's been like working on cars since she was 14, and so she builds a car and go races it. We're actually about to launch season 2, which is going to be down south in Texas, so that's going to be a lot of fun. And so we've got various other projects in the works, and since I don't know which are public yet and which not, I should probably stop here. But what we realized quickly is that obviously, you know, there are huge companies pumping huge amounts of money. I think like Netflix is pumping like 14 billion into content like every year. And so as much capital as we have, it's probably not the best use of capital to try to compete with that. And so what we're really focusing on is trying to find communities that care about openness. So, you know, open source developers, the web community, podcast community, those sorts of communities. And trying to give them technology to the extent that they want to use open technology to compete with Spotify and others who are trying to commercialize those spaces, and maybe not commercialize, but centralize those spaces. And so, you know, that's where we're getting the best traction, so that's where we're investing our resources.
So that's really exciting to hear. So we have a lot of technologies that are aimed, it might at least seem superficially aimed at the same problem. XRP Ledger is kind of aimed at payments, and it's also kind of aimed at asset exchange. And you have federated sidechains also kind of aimed at interoperability. And you have Interledger, which is kind of aimed at payments and interoperability. And it kind of sounds like superficially, like we're building a lot of different things all aiming to solve the same problem. And I'll just ask for your answer without contaminating it with my thoughts.
Yeah. Well, it was actually interesting because I think, part of when we started working on Interledger, it was, I was thinking about how to scale XRP Ledger, and obviously, when you're thinking about scaling any database, you're thinking about sharding, having more instances of it, and then
By the way, that's sharding. 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 Just in case anyone in the back didn't hear that clearly.
I love you.
Sharding.
And so whenever you do that, one of the biggest challenges is like, okay, well, now you've got your data split up in these different silos, so how do you connect it back together? But then it doesn't stop there because, at the time we were also thinking about how do we integrate with banks and their ledgers, right? And how do we integrate with all these legacy systems? And so we really started to try to think about interoperability holistically, right? Not, how do we solve interoperability for this like specific neighborhood, but for the world at large, right? And then that led us down the path to Interledger. But obviously that is a longer project. That's a bigger dream, a longer vision, and it takes time to, actually get a sizable network of that type. And then the other thing is because you're trying to serve everybody and everything, you have to really pare it down to the absolute minimum. And so, for example, Interledger can only move, fungible things, fungible value. And so, what if you want to move your non-fungible token from one chain to another? Well, now you need a different protocol, right? And so I think sidechains are sort of living on a layer between an individual ledger and the sort of global, very general interoperability network, which is more like the internet, which is Interledger. So I think it's just kind of in the middle, and, and it does more than Interledger does, but it does it for fewer use cases or fewer types of ledgers.
So we need them all?
What is that?
We need them all?
Yeah, I think so. And again, depends on what you're building, right? If you're just trying to get some value from A to B, like you're trying to pay for an API call or something like that, probably you should use Interledger. If you're trying to do some sort of use case where you have smart contracts on different ledgers talking to each other, like you have some smart contract that's trying to use the XRP Ledger decentralized exchange or something like that, you probably need something like sidechains, something that is aware of the capabilities of the ledgers you're working with.
It's also very difficult for a smart contract to be an Interledger endpoint. There's challenges associated with that.
Yeah, yeah. I think
something I don't.
I'm biased, but I would say that's probably more a problem with how we do smart contracts today than with Interledger, and I'll explain what I mean. I think the way we sort of approach smart contracts is okay. We're going to do these procedures that are running inside of our databases. Well, when you're making a procedure that's running inside of your database, it's very hard to have that call out to the outside world. And so we have to do this weird backwards thing where first the outside world has to tell that database about what's happening. So you have to build all these oracles and things. I don't think that's a good way to build business logic. And so, some of you might have heard of the Codius project. And I think, whenever Interledger is well enough established that you can actually, pay for things really easily using Interledger, I think that'll enable a different kind of smart contracts platform, whether it's Codius or someone else's idea that goes in a similar direction. And so then that type of platform has no issues making Interledger payments. It also has no issues integrating with legacy systems. It has no issues integrating with the weather API to check what the weather forecast is. It doesn't need any oracles. It's just a lot more straightforward way to build these things.
Oh, I totally agree. It's just nobody really knows how. We sort of know how to build something like that. It's just a lot of work and
yeah. I mean, we started building it and then realized okay, well now we need to find a way to pay these contracting nodes, and it's well shoot.
Yeah, I realized I can build this thing, but I have to do 10 years of work before I can use it. So let's start on that.
It's also interesting because this was when you first started trying to build Codius. A lot of this stuff around containerization and serverless and all this infrastructure, Kubernetes didn't exist. All this stuff didn't exist. And so nowadays, like suddenly there's all these tools that make it easier. And so if we wait another year or two, like there's going to be even more tools that make it super easy.
They were very primitive. They were just not robust enough to handle large amounts of dollars.
Exactly.
Like, and you don't want to make the mistake that many people made, putting billions of dollars on brand new, untested.
Yeah, it's sort of like you're trying to build a car, and then you realize no one's selling wheels yet, so you got to first invent a wheel, and then you realize no one's selling engines yet, so you got to first invent an engine, and it's just not a good way to spend your time, frankly. And so I think that where we ended up is like, what is the most useful primitive that would enable Codius and a lot of other things, and that ended up being IntelliJ, and so it's like, focus on one thing, and that's what we're focusing on.
So having been in this space longer than I have, actually, you kind of get this perspective of trying to figure out, like, I think we shared the same vision. I think very early it was just like making payments better, and I think later on this Internet of Value idea of moving money shouldn't be harder than sending an email. How do you feel about the progress that we've made? Has it been fast? Has it been slow? Are we on pace? Are we lagging? Are we way ahead? Like, I have to say, I see truth in all of those positions.
Yeah, exactly. I think, so if I think back to like 2010, I remember there was like a time we were all hanging out in IRC and kind of discussing where Bitcoin would be in 2020, and some people said like the Bitcoin price might be $100, and
I remember when that seemed absurd.
Exactly, and
like $1 million seems today.
Yeah, and you could use Bitcoin in every store, and those are some of the things we imagine. And I think like some places we overshot the goal, or we got more than we thought we would get. Like for example, on the Bitcoin price, like it went way higher than I could have ever imagined it would go.
Or we would have bought a lot more.
Yeah, I would have bought a lot more, yes. And on the other hand, in terms of like real world usage and am I using it day to day, like it probably didn't get as far as I thought it would. And so it's really interesting to think about some of the reasons for that. And I mean, I could get really in the weeds. I think one big thing was the way payments are done today, there's a certain set of features that you really need, like for example, recurring payments, subscriptions, that sort of thing. Even for like a simple payment, sometimes you need things like, once the merchant receives your order, they need to adjust the shipping fee. And so they need to charge you that adjusted shipping fee. Well, if you always need to have your wallet online and ready to make a signature, that's a little bit tricky, right? I think that there's actually a pretty interesting way to solve that, which is if people had sort of a personal server, and if you made it really easy for people to set up like a personal server, even if they're non-technical people, and then that personal server does all the stuff that like your phone would do when you're not online, I think that could be really powerful. That could be the thing that talks to the IntelliJ network. So you can do blockchain transactions and then connect to the IntelliJ network without necessarily having to have like a wallet provider. It would allow you to listen to events and like maybe some of these things where you need to look at a blockchain and react to something that's happening on a blockchain. Maybe your personal server takes care of that. All these kinds of things. So yeah, I don't know, but that doesn't exist. So that's just speculation.
People would probably think that you and I like talk fairly frequently. We sync about, me talking about what's going on at Ripple and you talking about what's going on at Quail. I think the last time we spoke before today was 4 or 5 months ago. And I remember saying, like, we need to talk more often, like, we should catch up. There's so much stuff. And probably our last talk before that was 4 months before that. And we had the exact same conversation again. It's like, we should really catch up. And I'm sure Stefan and I are going to leave today thinking, oh, man, I need to talk to him more. And then 4 months from now,
yeah, I mean, on the plus side, it is always such a pleasure to catch up. So, that's positive. I guess we're just really both very busy and, I was watching some of the presentations, and I guess as CTO, you get to take credit for your whole team, and like they've been doing an incredible amount of work and an incredible job.
Wait, I do? Nobody told me that.
Well, there you go. Well, people would be telling you if they weren't doing a good job, so there you go.
So
yeah, applause for the team.
Well, I started from, what this man left me, so I think applause for Stefan is okay. So On a scale of 8 to 10, how much do you regret leaving Ripple?
Well, I won't put a number on it, but I will say that I'll put a different number on it, which is when I was CTO, I was doing a lot more technical work, and I do miss that. It is being CEO means you're responsible for a lot of things like the culture of the company and things like that, and so it really challenged me to learn some new skills and expand on some areas that, like, as an introvert. And a lot of people who only know me from speaking on stage might not think I'm an introvert, but I really am. And so it was challenging, I'll admit, and I hope to someday, get back to, just being able to code for a week and not have to do anything else. So that was probably the toughest part. Other than that, it's been incredibly rewarding. I think the kinds of people that have decided to join us at Coil are some of the most amazing people I'd ever have the pleasure to work with, and that is incredibly humbling, because you're sort of like, why do they choose to work here if they could work in any of these other places? So.
Yeah, I was talking to Stefan backstage, and one of the things that I mentioned to him is, although it is very hard for me to not do technical things myself, I want to just code. What I've discovered is that the less I do, the more other people step up. That when people feel like, oh, David's going to do that, and everyone's going to think he did a better job than I could do, and so people don't grow.
Humbling, it's like the less I do myself, the better things work.
Right. I know. And the more you scale. There's only so many hours in a day in which I can be productive, and if other people don't step up. One of the first things that I did at Ripple is I made a list of all of my responsibilities, and I handed them off to other people. I'm like, I just literally, I took every single one. I remember I handed off Consensus to Scott Niederman. I'm like, do this work inside Consensus, and then, like, you're the Consensus person from now on. And it seems kind of lazy, but the idea is, if you hand everything off to everybody else, then you can work on the things where you can add the most value. If there's stuff that only you can do, then you have to do that.
Yeah, you can hand everything off and don't think you're just going to be sitting there doing nothing. It just means you're going to be doing more valuable things. I think it's a really good way of thinking about it.
And you can go away and great things still happen, rather than there being a mess when you come back.
Yeah.
So what do you think about your decision to start a company?
Obviously I'm very happy with the success we've had so far, and again, having such a top performing team means that a lot of projects are going really well. I think that the challenge of totally changing how the world exchanges and monetizes content is
just a small problem.
It's a fairly big challenge, and I think when we first raised the money from Spring, I think it's 265 million valued at the time, and if you convert it to dollars, and that seemed like such an incomprehensible amount, and, like, obviously we were like, we can do anything, But then once you're, like, competing with these companies that have, like, billions of dollars in budgets, and you're sort of, like, fighting for attention with, like, blockchain projects that have raised billions of dollars, and you're sort of like, it's actually, I feel like in some ways, not having had a company and other things when I first got into Bitcoin, I felt like I had more leverage in some ways, and so. It's really interesting to think about how can we do things like Grant for the Web, or other things where we can take the things that we have, like the capital, the connections, the experience with the technology, to empower other people that still have that freedom and that energy and spirit to build things, and they're not bogged down by all the other crap, and so. Yeah, I think that the best thing we can do is empower other people to work with this technology, and that's what open technology is really good at. That's why that's how the web became so successful. It's not because Tim Berners-Lee built everything and then everyone else just used it. It's like, no, because anyone can build something on top of it.
All right, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you one last question. Tell us another story from your time at Ripple. Something shocking, or something you're proud of, something you're embarrassed of that's even funnier.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm like, it's really hard to be like, here's a story, like, without any topic or subject matter.
How about something early? Something about when Ripple didn't have a nice office, or didn't have a large number of employees who could get things done.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I first joined, I was I was this freelancer from Switzerland, and I was working mostly as a PHP freelancer. So I would I would fix your PHP forum or something like that for $50 an hour. And then I came to the US, and first of all, that was impressive, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. And like Ripple sent an Uber to pick me up, which I've never been driven in like a limousine before, so I was like, this is wild, and so I was like, I'd never had a driver before, other than my parents, and so I showed up and I was like expecting like the grandest office of all time, and instead I walked into Rocket Space, which was a co-working space in a now demolished building because they decided it was unsafe, and so it's just like. It looked like a dilapidated factory. I was like,
working on some sort of a like adult video game, and we actually had an employee who complained that like the people across from us were looking at porn all day. It's like, dude, they're doing their jobs. Absolutely true, not falsified in any way.
Yep. I remember those guys.
Stefan, this was fun. I just want to thank you so much for coming to this event. I would love to do this all day. I can't believe they pay me to do this.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to the amazing community, and I'm so impressed with everything that everyone's working on, so thank you so much.
Stefan Thomas.